Inside California's Supermax prisons, total lockdown. In the far northwest corner of California, near the Oregon border, stands one of the most restrictive prison environments in the United States. Behind layers of electrified fencing, reinforced concrete, and constant surveillance sits a facility designed for one specific purpose: total control. This is Pelican Bay State Prison, home to one of the most controversial prison units in American history. The Security Housing Unit, commonly called the SHU. Inside this section of the prison, some inmates have spent decades almost entirely alone. No group activities. No contact with other prisoners. No open yards. For years, the routine rarely changed. A concrete cell. 22 to 24 hours a day inside. Limited human interaction. These conditions were not accidental. They were created intentionally as part of California's strategy to contain what officials believed were the most dangerous prison gang leaders in the state. But over time, the SHU system would spark one of the biggest debates in American corrections. Does extreme isolation improve prison safety? Or does it create a different kind of crisis behind the walls? Today, we're going inside California's Supermax system. Examining how it was built, how it operates, and why it became one of the most controversial incarceration policies in modern history. And to understand it, we first need to look at the prison that became its symbol. Pelican Bay. The most isolated prison in California. Pelican Bay State Prison opened in 1989 in Del Norte County, California, just a few miles from the Pacific coastline. The location itself was deliberate. The region is remote, heavily forested, and far from major cities. For correctional officials, this isolation offered two advantages. First, it reduced the chance of organized prison breaks. Second, it allowed the state to construct a facility specifically designed for maximum security incarceration. Unlike older prisons that were gradually modified over decades, Pelican Bay was built from the ground up with a different concept in mind. Total containment. The prison was divided into several sections, but one unit quickly became its most notorious feature. The Security Housing Unit, or SHU. This section of the prison was designed to hold inmates considered leaders of violent prison gangs. Individuals involved in serious assaults inside prison. Prisoners deemed ongoing threats to institutional safety. The SHU was built differently from traditional prison housing. Instead of bars, cells were constructed with solid steel doors. Instead of windows facing outside, many cells had only small perforated metal openings. And instead of communal movement, prisoners were typically escorted one at a time. The design of total lockdown. The architecture of the Security Housing Unit was built around a single operational philosophy. Isolation. Each cell measured roughly 8 feet by 10 feet. Inside the cell were only basic fixtures. A concrete bed. A combination toilet and sink unit. A small desk surface molded into the wall. The doors were solid metal, preventing prisoners from seeing each other directly. Communication between cells was possible, but limited. In many cases, inmates attempted to speak through vents or small gaps in the doors. Movement outside the cell followed a strict schedule. Typically, inmates were allowed about 90 minutes of recreation per day. But even that recreation happened alone. Instead of a shared yard, prisoners were escorted to individual outdoor enclosures. These spaces were often described by observers as concrete exercise pens. The enclosures were surrounded by high walls, leaving only a small opening to the sky above. Who was sent to the SHU? Not every prisoner at Pelican Bay was placed in the SHU. Most inmates lived in the prison's general population units. Placement in the SHU followed specific criteria established by the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, known as CDCR. There were two primary pathways into the unit. The first involved serious disciplinary violations. For example, inmates found responsible for violent attacks inside prison could be placed in the SHU for fixed terms. These terms could range from months to several years depending on the offense. The second pathway was far more controversial. Gang validation. Under this policy, prison investigators could designate an inmate as a member or associate of a prison gang. If validated, that prisoner could be placed in the SHU indefinitely. This system relied on various types of evidence, including confidential informants, written materials, tattoos associated with gangs, communication records. Supporters argued the system was necessary to disrupt organized prison violence. Critics argued it often relied on circumstantial evidence and could lead to extremely long periods of isolation. Life inside the cell. Daily life inside the SHU followed a routine that changed very little. Most inmates remained inside their cells for at least 22 hours per day. Meals were delivered through a narrow slot in the door. Showers occurred several times per week, but even this involved strict security procedures. When it was time to leave the cell, officers typically required inmates to place their hands through the slot to be handcuffed first. Only after restraints were applied would the door open. Movement through the unit involved multiple officers and controlled escort procedures. This level of control reflected the original purpose of the SHU. To separate inmates considered capable of organizing violence inside prison. But over time, questions began to emerge about how long prisoners were staying there. Some inmates had been held in the unit not for months, not for years, but for decades. The controversy begins. By the early 2000s, Pelican Bay's security housing unit had become the subject of growing national attention. Attorneys, journalists, and human rights organizations began documenting the length of time some prisoners had spent in isolation. According to several investigations, certain inmates had remained in the SHU for more than 20 years. Many of these placements were tied to gang validation rather than new violent incidents. Prison officials defended the policy. They argued that prison gangs had historically been responsible for serious violence, both inside and outside correctional facilities. Removing gang leadership from the general population, they said, was essential for safety. But critics argued something else was happening. A system originally designed for short-term control had evolved into long-term isolation housing. And that debate would soon lead to one of the largest prison protests in California history. The origins of California's Supermax strategy. The rise of prison gangs. To understand why California eventually built Supermax units like the SHU at Pelican Bay State Prison, it's necessary to look decades earlier. During the 1960s and 1970s, prison officials across California began documenting the emergence of organized inmate groups that operated with structure, leadership, and long-term goals. These groups became known as prison gangs. Unlike informal inmate alliances, prison gangs often had defined hierarchies and membership rules. Some developed codes of conduct, symbols, and tattoos used to identify members. Correctional officials increasingly believed these organizations could influence violence inside prison systems. Among the groups frequently identified in California correctional records were organizations such as mexicanmafia, nuestrafamilia, aryanbrotherhood, and blackguerrillafamily. Each of these groups developed in different prisons and at different times. Their histories are complex and sometimes disputed in certain details. But by the late 20th century, correctional authorities widely considered them among the most influential prison gangs in California. Officials argued these groups were capable of ordering assaults, coordinating smuggling operations, and influencing inmates across multiple facilities. This perception shaped how the state began to think about prison security. If gang leadership could control violence from inside general population housing units, officials believed separating those leaders might reduce organized attacks. And that idea would eventually lead to the creation of long-term isolation units. The violence that shaped policy. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, prison violence became a growing concern in California's correctional system. Reports from the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation documented assaults on both inmates and staff across several major institutions. Some of these incidents were connected to gang rivalries. Others stemmed from individual conflicts or broader tensions inside overcrowded prisons. One facility frequently mentioned in historical records was San Quentin State Prison, which has operated since the 19th century and housed many high-profile inmates. Another was Folsom State Prison, known for its maximum security population. By the early 1980s, California's prison population had increased significantly due to tougher sentencing laws and changes in criminal justice policy. Overcrowding became a serious operational challenge. Facilities built for far fewer inmates were now holding far more than originally planned. Within that environment, prison administrators began looking for new ways to isolate inmates they believed were responsible for organizing violence. Officials argued that traditional disciplinary segregation units were not sufficient. Those units were typically designed for short-term punishment, not long-term containment. So a new idea began to take shape. A prison unit designed entirely around isolation. The creation of Pelican Bay. In the mid-1980s, California officials approved construction of a new prison facility in Del Norte County, near the Oregon border. The prison would be built from the ground up with modern security features. It would also include a unit unlike any other in the state. The Security Housing Unit. When Pelican Bay State Prison opened in 1989, the SHU immediately became its defining feature. The unit was designed to house over 1,000 inmates in isolation cells. Architects and corrections planners studied emerging Supermax concepts that had been used in other states. The goal was to create an environment where prisoners could be securely held with minimal direct contact. Every element of the design reflected that philosophy. Thick concrete walls. Solid steel doors. Electronic surveillance. And highly controlled movement. Correctional officials believed this system would allow them to separate individuals identified as major gang leaders or chronic violent offenders. But almost immediately, the SHU began drawing attention from outside observers. Civil rights organizations questioned whether the conditions could be safely maintained for long periods. At that time, however, the system expanded. By the early 1990s, Pelican Bay's SHU was operating at near capacity. The gang validation system. One of the most powerful tools used by California prison officials was the gang validation process. This system allowed investigators within the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation to officially classify an inmate as a gang member or associate. Once validated, the inmate could be transferred to the SHU. The process typically relied on a combination of evidence. This could include confidential informant testimony, possession of gang-related writings or artwork, photographs with known gang members, tattoos associated with specific organizations, letters or coded messages. Investigators were required to document multiple pieces of evidence before validation. However, critics later argued that some of these indicators were open to interpretation. For example, possession of certain books or artwork could sometimes be interpreted as gang affiliation depending on context. Once validated, an inmate could remain in the SHU indefinitely unless they met specific conditions for release. For many years, one of the primary ways to leave the SHU involved debriefing. This meant providing information about gang activities to prison investigators. Supporters of the policy said it helped break gang control inside prisons. Critics argued it placed inmates in a difficult position, potentially exposing them to retaliation if they returned to general population. The debate around this system would eventually lead to major legal challenges. Daily operations inside the SHU. Inside the Security Housing Unit, daily operations followed strict protocols designed to reduce risk. Correctional officers typically worked in teams when escorting inmates. Before leaving their cells, prisoners were usually required to submit to restraints. Hands would be cuffed behind the back through the cell door slot. Once the door opened, officers guided the inmate through controlled corridors toward showers, medical appointments, or recreation areas. Every movement was documented. This level of control reflected the prison administration's belief that SHU inmates represented a higher security risk. But the design also meant that human contact was extremely limited. In many cases, inmates interacted primarily with correctional staff delivering meals or conducting security checks. Family visits were possible, but they typically occurred through non-contact visitation rooms, separated by thick glass. Phone access was also restricted compared with general population units. Over time, these conditions raised broader questions about the long-term effects of isolation. Psychologists, legal scholars, and human rights organizations began studying the issue more closely. Their findings would soon push the SHU system into the national spotlight. Growing national attention. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, the use of long-term isolation in American prisons had become a growing topic of debate. Pelican Bay's SHU often appeared at the center of that conversation. Investigative journalists documented cases of inmates who had spent 10, 15, or even 20 years in isolation housing. Correctional officials continued to defend the policy. They argued that the SHU had helped reduce organized gang violence inside the broader prison system. But critics argued that the practice raised serious ethical and legal concerns. Some researchers pointed to psychological studies suggesting that extended isolation could affect mental health. Others questioned whether inmates were receiving adequate review of their SHU placements. The debate continued to intensify. And eventually, it reached the inmates themselves. Inside the walls of Pelican Bay, a group of prisoners began organizing a protest that would draw international attention. Inside California's Supermax prisons, the walls are thicker, the silence is deeper, and the rules are stricter than almost anywhere else in the American prison system. For decades, facilities like Pelican Bay's Security Housing Unit have represented one of the most extreme approaches to prison security. Built to control violence, contain gang leadership, and maintain order behind the walls. But the debate over isolation, safety, and human rights continues to this day. If you found this documentary informative, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue creating deeply researched crime and prison documentaries. And if you want to see more stories about the realities of life behind prison walls, check out the other videos on the channel. Until next time, this is Beyond the Bars.